Tritone substitution is a great way to create some surprising sounds in your solos or in your chord melody arrangements. It's definitely something you want to have in your toolbox. In this video, I'm going to talk about what tritone substitution is, and I'm going to talk about this from a little bit of music theory, but I'm also going to use more of a visual approach because that works really well for this topic and it also works really well on the guitar. Tritone substitution is also a great way to open up another difficult topic, namely the altered dominant. And especially when it comes to soloing over altered dominants, if you use tritone substitution as a way of getting into that, then you get a lot of options and it makes a lot more sense. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. You can use tritone substitution to make your chord progressions or your solos a little bit more interesting by introducing some unexpected sounds or chords. And this is something that we do on dominant chords. Sometimes you can extend it to an entire 2/5. I might talk about that a little bit later in the video, but essentially this is something that only works for dominant chords. And it actually also only really works for dominant chords that resolve. So if we have a G7 like this one, then here this is just a G7 shell voicing. And I have the root, the 7th and the 3rd. And it's worth noticing that D flat 7 actually is pretty much the same chord, except for the root, because the root here is a tritone away. So D flat 7 and G7, they actually share 3rd and 7th. It turns around, so for G, the F is the 7th, and for D flat, that's the 3rd. But the notes are the same. So these two chords we can substitute for one another. And if I do that in a 2-5-1 in C major, then we get this. When I do this with the shell voicings, then the G7 and the D flat 7 actually sound really similar. But if I start adding some more extensions to the chords, then you can really hear the difference and all the extra sounds that we get in there by making the tritone substitution. And here I think it's quite clear that the D flat 7 is really creating some more tension and sounding a little bit out of place, but in that way also just moving the progression along in a nice way. And that's kind of how you want to use tritone substitutes like this. Before we move into how to solo on the tritone substitutions, I think it's maybe useful just to have a look at how you can add them to a chord progression. So we already have them in a 2-5-1. If we take a turn around the key of C major, then C major to A7 to D minor to G7. Now we have two dominants in here, and those are the ones we can use tritone substitution on. So the A7, and the A7 is in this case resolving down to D minor, so we can use a tritone substitution there. And the tritone substitute of A is E flat, so now we have this sound. And then of course the G7, the tritone here is D flat 7, so now we have this progression instead. In this case, we're using a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, and the D flat 7 is not a resolving dominant because D flat 7 wants to resolve to G flat major, but now it's going to C major. And that means that the scale you would want to use on that would be a D flat Lydian dominant. So that would be this scale. And it's very useful to notice, both in general, but also for what's happening later in this video, that D flat Lydian dominant is in fact the same as A flat melodic minor, which is also the same as G altered. If you want to explore how to improvise over a chord, then a great thing to check out just to get some different sounds and have some different arpeggios that you can use is to take the diatonic arpeggios of each of the chord tones and explore if they work for the sound of the chord. Now that doesn't always work for all of them, but in this case it's melodic minor, and actually it does work for all of them, as I'll show you in these 4 examples. So in this first example, I'm just using the basic arpeggio of the chord, which obviously will work because the chord works. So first I'm just playing D minor 7 arpeggio and then a D flat 7 arpeggio, resolving that to C major 7. Whatever chord you're improvising over, then the arpeggio from the 3rd of the chord is almost always a great option. And the tritone substitution here is not really an exception there. So first I'm playing the arpeggio from the 3rd of the D minor, so that's an F major 7 chord, or arpeggio. And then I'm going into the arpeggio from the D flat 7. So actually that's still, the third is still F, but the arpeggio that I have over this chord is an F half diminished. So, and then resolving that down to the ninth of the C major 7, the D. Very often when you start working with the arpeggio found on the fifth of the chord, then it can get a little bit vague because you're missing the original third. So that means that in this case, I don't have the original third of the chord, the F, in the chord or in the arpeggio anymore. But in the case of the D flat 7, in this context, it doesn't really matter too much. So I'm first using a D minor triad and then the A flat minor major arpeggio, and then resolving that to C. And finally, the arpeggio from the 7th of the D flat 7, which is a B major 7 sharp 5, which is already sort of a very specific sound, which works really well because that in itself is going to be surprising in a line. And also in this case, it's something that kind of voice leads or fits together with the F major 7 really nicely. So I have the F major 7 and then this B major 7 sharp 5, and then resolving that to the major 7 of the C. Now that you have an idea about how this D flat 7 works and what you can play over it, just take a step back and look at this really common D flat 7 voicing. So this is D flat 7 with a 9, you probably know it like this as well. But in fact, if we put a G in the bass of this one, then we have a G7 with a flat 9 and a flat 13. And that's really a very common voicing for G7 altered. Now the same goes if we have this D flat 7 with a 13. Now if we put a G in the bass of that one, then we have a G7 sharp 9. So again, we have a voicing that's very common for G altered. And that means that we can actually use all the material from D flat 7, both the chord voicings and the solo material, over G altered. That's a really useful thing to point out, because if you start working on playing altered dominants, in the beginning, when you look at the altered scale, you don't actually have a dominant chord or a dominant arpeggio. If we look at A flat melodic minor or G altered, then there's no G7 in there. And that makes it difficult to have something to make lines from, because we usually make lines from arpeggios and scale notes and sort of combining those two things. And that means that your licks are going to be just running up and down the scale and not really knowing what's going on. But if we can use all the material from the D flat 7, then we actually have 4 arpeggios, like I just showed you, that all will work really well for G altered. And then we have a lot more material that we can start working with. Just to give you some examples of how you can use the arpeggios that we found for the D flat 7 on a G7 altered, here are 3 examples that are using those 4 arpeggios. So the first one here is really just combining the F half diminished with the D flat 7 and then resolving that down to a G and the C major 7. The second one is introducing a little bit more interesting rhythms and not just playing all 8 notes. And the line is kind of coming out on the B, on the forehand of the D minor bar, and then using the A flat minor major arpeggio, but then played as a triplet, so like this, and then just running down the scale to resolve. This example is using the B major 7 sharp 5. I'm calling it a B major 7 sharp 5 because we're on a G altered and we're kind of thinking in the context of a C major. Because of course, if you're thinking from A flat minor melodic, then it is in fact a C flat, but that doesn't really make sense in the context here. So the way I'm playing it here is again using a triplet and also just making the rhythm a little bit more interesting. So it's really coming out on the B flat here, which of course is the sharp 9 on the G7, and then running down the arpeggio, and then resolving to the 9th of C major. And actually, you can use this trick of the tritone substitution directly in the practice when you're working on a song. So a good example of that could be the bridge of Stella by Starlight, because there you have this 2 bars of G7, which it's of course not really a G7 altered, but you can use a G7 altered there. And then instead of thinking G7 altered when you're trying to make lines on it, start thinking D flat 7, and then try and use some of the tritone substitution material, and that way see how that works and start thinking about that as G7 altered and ease into that altered sound. The way that I'm talking about the tritone substitutions and the altered dominance in this video, they are all part of melodic minor harmony. So I'm using the altered scale, and I'm also using a Lydian dominant scale. The melodic minor scale is super useful in jazz. It's a sound that you definitely want to have in there. And if you want to check out a video where I'm talking about how to get started working with melodic minor and also really just building a strong foundation so that you can use it in all the different places like Lydian dominance and also dominance, then check out this video.